how do you help somebody figure out purpose?
Well, first and foremost, I say it's a lot easier than we think. And second of all, I try to take the stakes down. You don't find your purpose, you create it. So again, purpose has to do with present and future. It's all about action. You actually create your purpose. So it's not that there's this one thing that if you find it, life is good. And if you don't find it, you've missed your calling. I just don't look at purpose that way. Instead, I think purpose is an abundant, and there are a million different things you could do. The question is, what types of things suit you? So you don't find a sense of purpose, but you do need to find some things to anchor that purpose in, what I call some inklings or some beckonings, some things that call to you so that you can then build a life of purpose around it. I call those purpose anchors.
Welcome to the Childfree Wealth Podcast, hosted by Bree and Dr. J, Certified Financial Planner. Here we discuss life and finances as it relates to being child-free. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Please consult your advisor before implementing any ideas heard on this podcast.
Hey, Childfree Wealth listeners. Today I have a really cool guest, Jordan Grumet, who you might have heard as Doc G. You've actually seen him on our podcast. We actually re-aired an episode that I did on his podcast. And he shared with me his new book coming out, The Purpose Code. And I was digging into it because I've been doing a lot of work on impact and what's the point of life. And boy, did this book, it's the right timing. Now, give you a little kind of his background. If you haven't found Jordan Grumet yet, he's got a whole bunch of stuff out there. The Earn and Invest podcast, you got to check it out. A couple other books. But he's a medical doc who's now working in hospice and has had those conversations at end of life, what's the point? What are we doing? What's life look like? And he dives into it in the book, and it's going to be awesome to dig into the conversation. So if you've ever kind of asked the question yes, so what? What's the point? What's next? It's time to listen. So welcome to the podcast. Introduce yourself. You and I were just talking beforehand about your summer and all that. You and I are both on the book tour thing. So tell me about what's going on with you in your life.
First and foremost, thank you for the warm introduction. Yeah, just like you, I've been lucky enough to figure out my finances to the level that I could start thinking about, well, what kind of life do I want to really live? For me, that meant running away from being a doctor, which I didn't appreciate or enjoy anymore, focusing on a part-time hospice gig where I work 10 or 15 hours a week, and then exploring some of these bigger life questions, both through my podcast, which is Earn and Invest, but also through being a hospice doctor and having the privilege to sit with people as they talk about what they're thinking about when they're dying. And from all of that came my first book, Taking Stock. And a big part of taking stock was the fact that I told people, hey, we should really be putting purpose before finances. And a lot of people said, that sounds great, but I have no idea what my purpose is. And in fact, it's making me anxious. And that led to this book, The Purpose Code.
That's fair. And I'm going to ask you a question kind of off the script of this. We'll come back to your book in a second. But because we serve people that are child-free, people who never have kids, have you seen a difference at that hospice world of we always get kind of well, you'll regret it when you're older, or without kids, you've lost your purpose. I got to ask, what have you seen the difference between parents and people without kids?
Well, this is actually one of the things that I thought a lot about when I wrote the book. And in the book, I actually talk about how people shouldn't be your purpose. Specifically, your kids should not be your purpose. The truth of the matter is, I've sat with many dying people, and the people without kids and the people with kids, it wasn't whether they had kids or not, which was the deciding factor. It was much more, did they pursue those things that were important outside of themselves, the things that really lit them up. And so you could imagine that for some percentage of the population, the idea of having kids lights them up. But I would argue for those people too, it's not really the having kids that ends up being your purpose. It's doing something else that creates the best you that you can be. And if you do that, whether you have kids or not, you're going to touch other people around you. And so a lot of people I know who never had kids, one of the sentinel people in my book that I talk about, this guy named Roman who owned an antique store, he never had kids. And yet by being his best self and pursuing his own sense of purpose, he actually touched the lives of many people around him, including some of the kids who became part of the community around. He would buy and sell baseball cards and built a community around that. So the truth of the matter is, I don't think that's true. I don't think when people are dying, they say, boy, I really regret I didn't have kids, unless having kids was central to their sense of purpose and it just didn't work out. So there's a small percentage of people who are like, I really want to have kids. They can't have kids. For some reason, they don't adopt or it doesn't happen. And then they look back and say, this was important to me and I didn't pursue it. But that's a very small percentage of people.
It matches what we've seen. But, it's one of those, we get that question all the time. Like, who's going to take care of you when you're older, and all the other baggage around and regret. And then and we'll get to the whole book in a second, but there's some big things in here I got to talk about. You even mentioned in here this myth of parenthood, that you got to sacrifice yourself for your kids, and that's the noble pursuit. Talk to me about that, because I know you have kids, and I'm not judging people who have kids. That's not my point at all. But there was this section in there you're talking about this person and kind of the balancing act, and it's got to be a story you tell on here.
Yeah, you're talking about the myth of joyful parenthood. And there's this theory, and there's some data that backs it up, that having kids is so hard that we convince ourselves that we love it to make up for the fact that we're spending so much time and energy doing it. And again, this gets back to this point of, if your children are your purpose, you're probably going to end up feeling a little bit lost, because guess what? Those kids grow up and they move away. And here's the problem too. Your listeners don't have to worry about that. But if you make your kids your purpose, when they become adults, their modeling is going to tell them the only reasonable version of purpose is having their own kids. And what I'd really like to teach my kids, because I do have children, is that they should go after the things that light them up, that feel exciting to them, that really fill them up. That's what I want my kids to do when they're older. But if I don't do that myself, how am I going to pass on that kind of modeling? So I really think we miss the point when we make other people, specifically kids, our sense of purpose. I think there are other things that light us up that we do for us. And that's totally okay, because in the process of doing things for us, I believe we actually have a very big impact and legacy, which we talk about in the book quite a bit. This idea that when you are your best self, you end up creating communities around you, and that's how you change the world.
Yeah, so we always say that as, you're not leaving a genetic legacy as a child-free person, but you still have a legacy. You still have an impact.
Oh, yeah, huge.
You and I think we both would do the same type of thing. I'm trying to get people, when we go to a party, instead of asking somebody, hey, what do you do for a living? I think that's a terrible question. But you can ask them, hey, what impact do you want to make in the world? What matters to you? And it doesn't have to be hey, I'm taking over the giant corporations and do the big things. It can be, I want the best garden in the world that matters to me, and that, helps butterflies grow. I don't care what. And you talk about that as the big P, the little P purpose. Talk to me about that, impact, purpose. How does this combine? And do you have to take over the world? Because we as child-free folks because you're child-free, you have to you have to accomplish something else to make up for it. And I'm like, no, you don't. And I think your big P, little P kind of gets to that.
For sure. And first and foremost, when we meet people in a party, it would be such a weird question, but it would tell us so much more if we could say, if we could ask someone, what are you doing when you are most you? What are you doing when you're most lit up and excited? That's the question we really want to ask people, because a lot of times it isn't their job. It's that hobby, that thing that they do when no one else is around that really lights them up. So it's a better question. When it comes to impact and legacy, it is a complicated story, but let me first dispel some of the myths about purpose. Most of us are operating today feeling like purpose has to be big and audacious, and it has to change the world, obviously. And this is what I call big P purpose. This is very goal-oriented purpose. I want to become president. I want to be a billionaire. I want to cure cancer. I want to do all these very big, difficult to accomplish things that's going to mean that I did enough, that I'm enough, that everything is okay, and I've made my impact on the world. Here's the problem with what that is, which is big P purpose. One is, it's actually very scarcity mindset oriented. There are only a few people who can become president. There are only a few people who are going to cure cancers. There are only a few people who are going to become billionaires. Everyone else kind of fails at that. They're also all or nothing. A lot of times it's either you succeed or you don't. And so they're very, very easy to fail. And last but not least, a lot of times we set these goals to be so huge that we don't necessarily have 100% agency to achieve them. So to become president, you have to be the right person at the right time, saying the right things with the right skill set, and you have to have a lot of luck. Let's say you have almost all of that, but you happen to be born a foreign citizen outside of the US and move here when you're 2 years old and then become a citizen. You're already disqualified, even if you have everything else. So if you stake your claim on what I call big P purpose, goal-oriented purpose, most likely you're going to be disappointed and anxious and feel bad. And a lot of times you might find that you're not even enjoying the process of doing these things because you feel so bad because you're not reaching this ultimate goal. The other side of that is little p purpose. What I call little p purpose is process-oriented purpose that isn't as worried about the goal. So it's not whether you get to the end or the top of the mountain, it's whether you enjoy the process of climbing up. This is abundance mindset oriented. Like, how many things could we love doing? It is not all or nothing, it's all or all. You can't fail, you just have to show up and do it. And this sense of purpose, I believe, is more associated with things like happiness, longevity, and health. There are lots of studies that show having a sense of purpose in life is associated with all of those things. But as you mentioned, everyone then argues, well, if I do big P purpose, I'm going to have a huge impact. But if I do little P purpose, I might be making myself happy, but I'm not changing the world. And this is where I disagree. The truth of the matter is a lot of people go for big P purpose, fail, and feel disappointed. But when you go for little p purpose, a lot of times you do things that light you up. And like a moth to the flame, other people are attracted to you because they see you being your best self. And when that happens, you collaborate with them, you form communities, you become a community member. Maybe sometimes you're a teacher, other times you're a student. And those connections are impact and legacy. Those connections change the world in what I call generational growth. We talk a lot about generational trauma, what we hand down to the next bunch of generations that causes them problems, right? We give them these narratives, these scripts that hurt them, and it doesn't even have to be your family. You can pass them down to your nieces and nephews. You can pass them down to your community. The point is we have these traumatic narratives that we grew up with that we pass around to all the people that we know. We rarely talk about generational growth, which is those really positive narratives. And a lot of those positive narratives center around things we do that are really, really purposeful. In the beginning of my book, I talk actually about a guy who impacted my life. His name was Roman. He owned an antique store. And at some point, he got lit up by the idea of selling baseball cards, not for anyone else, not to make $1 million. He did it because it fulfilled his sense of little p purpose. He did that. And he created a community of kids around him, and I was one of them. I was a geek. I was a nerd. My father died when I was 7. I had no community, no friends. And all of a sudden, there was this bastion, this place I could go that was automatic community. And we had our mentor, Roman, who would hang out with us. He'd give us advice. If we had a bad day, he'd give us a free pack of baseball cards. That guy changed my life. I would have never become the confident, happy person I became. I probably wouldn't have become a doctor. A lot of the people who ended up there, the geeks and the nerds and the misfits, found a place and did amazing things with their lives. And those people changed the world, all because of this guy, Roman, who basically was just doing something he really enjoyed, his sense of little p purpose. Roman died actually of cancer a few years after I stopped going to his baseball card shop. But 30, 40 years later, I'm still talking about him. He's still impacting my life. A, Roman didn't have any kids. And B, Roman didn't change the world. He didn't become a billionaire. He didn't become a president. He didn't do any of these kind of big, audacious things. But his little impact on the world, like a pebble dropping into the ocean, has displaced a little water. And that water continues to travel 40 years later. Sometimes it joins with other waves to get really big and mighty. Other times it dissipates till it's just a tiny little wave. But it's still washing up on the shores hundreds of miles away 40 years later. That's impact, and it has nothing to do with these really big, difficult to accomplish goals.
I'm with you. I think as a society, goals are everything. I mean, like, people put way too much on it. You know, like, I got to get the gold star. I got to move up. I got to do this and the other. And I think in the financial community, I want your take on this, because for those that haven't followed Jordan's work or Earn and Invest, he does a lot of stuff on financial independence. But I wonder if the FIRE movement is that big P, kind of like, I got to get to the big goal, because I see a lot of people get to it and then they're like the dog that caught the car. They're like, and And they lost the trip on the way. We have an approach we call FILE, financial live early, kind of more about the life and the balance. But maybe the FIRE community is going after the big P, but then like you get it. And then like what?
I agree with you 100%. I think a lot of people use FIRE as their big P. And here's the problem with it. The problem is you get there and one of a few things happens. Well, first and foremost, one of the problems is you might not get there, which just leaves you disappointed, right? But what if you do get there? One of two things happens. Either you look around, you're like, I spent all this time doing things maybe I didn't like, not building a life of purpose, but just getting to this monetary place. Now I'm here and I don't know what to do with myself. Why don't I create double the goal? Why don't I double down? Because now I'm at a loss and I really enjoyed going after FIRE. So for me, my FIRE number was $1 million. Now I don't know what to do, but it felt good to go for that first $1 million. So let's now call it 2 million. And you're back off to the races, but it doesn't necessarily make you any more happy and you're not really doing anything more purposeful. That's one possibility. The other possibility is you get petrified you're going to lose it. Like the stock market's going to go down. All of a sudden you had $1 million, but now you're going to have 990,000. You're not going to be financially independent anymore. And that's called loss aversion and actually can cause more stress and anxiety than even getting there. So let's get to the root cause of the problem. In the book, I actually talk about happiness is two things. It's meaning and purpose. And they're actually two different things, although people think they're the same. Meaning, in my opinion, is how we cognitively think about our past. It's all about thoughts, and it's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Happy people tend to tell themselves heroic stories about themselves in the past, regardless of how bad it was. And unhappy people tend to tell themselves victim stories about their past, no matter how moderate or mild it was. But really, meaning is all about getting to a sense of enough. Happy people look at their past, no matter how bad it was, and say, but I'm better today, so I was enough, I had enough, and life is good. Unhappy people basically say, I never had enough, I was a victim, I wasn't smart enough, no one gave me enough privilege, whatever it was. And so if you don't have that meaning part figured out and you try to jump to purpose, purpose is being financially independent, the problem is you don't feel enough on the inside and you can't purpose your way to enough. So if you try to make FIRE your purpose, but you haven't covered the meaning problem, you're going to get there and then you're going to realize, but I still don't feel enough. Like I got there, I got to this big goal, this big audacious thing that was supposed to be important, it was supposed to fill me up and it didn't. Because I don't feel enough on the inside, and that's not doing it. So again, let's double down. Let's go to 2 million. Let's whatever we're going to do. Well, the right answer actually is to reassess those narratives of our past and build a better sense of meaning to realize that we were always enough, and financial independence has nothing to do with it. Purpose is not about our past, and it's not about our thoughts. It's about our present and future, and it's about actions. And so if we get to a good sense of meaning, we can then move into our present and future and joyfully do these activities, these actions. Once you realize that purpose will never prove that you're enough, it relieves you of the stress of trying to prove yourself every time you accomplish something. And instead, you can focus on the process of doing those things that you really enjoy.
And let's be real. I mean, everybody talks about, enjoying the journey and how does it fit, journey before destination. Like there's different ways to word it, but you're challenging a core belief of a society. Let's be real of that, and we talk about it as what happens when you hit the child-free midlife crisis, which is you hit your personal, professional, financial goals. And then you're like, now what? Is this all I'm going to do for the rest of my life? Am I just going to keep grinding away, adding more zeros? Like, because for people that are child-free, we don't have like, I'm going to put my goals on my kids. Because you do see people do that. Like, I hit mine, I'm just going to just transfer it to, or I'm going to keep making more money so I can set them up for generational wealth, or we don't have any of that. So we got people in their, kind of 30s, 40s hitting this point and they're like, so what? What's the point? Which is the purpose question. But what I'm challenged by when I'm working with my clients is I don't know if it's possible to completely throw away your goal-driven nature and shift to the small P purpose. And I'm with you. I'm like, I'm reading the book. I'm like, I got you, but you've spent 40 years learning how to get the gold star. What I've worked with my clients on is, okay, let's shift that to something that matters to you, or let's shift it to maybe in your case, the small P purpose. Like, but it's still like, I can't reprogramming you from goal-driven stuff.
So there are a few things. One is, I'll start by saying that I have nothing wrong with goals. I just think we need to be more goal agnostic. So I don't think we have to be goal phobic. I think you can set up goals, but your sense of happiness and purpose can't rely on reaching the goal. You've got to enjoy the process of getting there. And whether you reach the goal or not, it's almost like a bonus. Hey, I reached the goal. Great. Hey, I didn't reach the goal. Well, I'm really enjoying what I'm doing now. It doesn't matter. But I would really urge for those achievement addicts, I don't feel they'll truly find peace unless they go back and deal with their sense of meaning. Because again, achievement addicts are people who are basically saying, I don't feel enough in life. And the way to feel enough, you will never feel enough by accomplishing things. It hasn't worked already. Like these achievement addicts, they get to 40 and they've achieved ungodly things. I mean, Elon Musk is a perfect example of this. Elon Musk has more money than God and has produced some of the most amazing things in the world. And the guy, if you look at him, he's miserable. Why is he miserable? Because Elon Musk had a shitty childhood and never learned he was enough. And he's going to keep on trying to achieve his way to enough. He's going to keep on trying to purpose his way to enough, and he's going to be miserable. If the achievement addict really wants to feel better, they need to do some serious therapy, what I call narrative therapy, or what is called narrative therapy, where they go back and really assess these narratives and start trying to figure out why their childhood left them feeling so not enough. Honestly, can channel these people into a better sense of goals that are maybe more fulfilling or goals that help the world better. But I don't think they're ever really going to feel good until they answer that enough question. And that is all about the past and not about the present and future. Purpose is about the present and future. Enough and meaning are about the past. And so we have a lot of people who are really troubled by and don't want to go and reassess the past.
And I get it. Like, I mean, our clients, we talk about it as the standard life script. This says you go to school, you get married, you have kids, you know, the American dream, the house, the 2.5 kids, all that. And you've chosen a different life path for whatever reason. And the hard part is you get drawn back because of society, because of culture, other things saying, well, but you missed a step. Like you didn't do something. And I'm like, who cares? Like I didn't get to be an astronaut either.
Something. But they're also trying to sell you something. So society and marketing and influencers are all trying to sell you a sense of purpose. They don't want you to have your own sense of purpose. They want you to have their sense of purpose so you will buy whatever they're selling. Period.
I'm with you. And let's be real, we're in a political season and people are trying to sell you stuff every day. I mean, there's a whole lifestyle. Like, okay, I believe you. I got you on the purpose thing. I get the little P, the big P. But I'll ask folks, this is kind of the joking way to say it. I'm like, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? Kind of like, what do you want to do with your life? And that's where it's kind of like, the usual answer is, I don't know. And I usually follow it up and they'll say, and nobody's ever asked me that question. Kind of like, you know, because like there's things this is a good boy, good girl things. These are the things you do. And I'm like, okay, you went up the career, you rang the bell. Now what? You're just not going to stand up there and keep ringing the bell. Like, what's the point? How do you help people to go, I don't have a freaking clue what I want because I technically got what I wanted, like, or what I thought I wanted or what the 18-year-old version of me wanted. How do you help somebody figure out purpose?
Well, first and foremost, I say it's a lot easier than we think. And second of all, I try to take the stakes down. You don't find your purpose, you create it. So again, purpose has to do with present and future. It's all about action. You actually create your purpose. So it's not that there's this one thing that if you find it, life is good. And if you don't find it, you've missed your calling. I just don't look at purpose that way. Instead, I think purpose is an abundant, and there are a million different things you could do. The question is, what types of things suit you? So you don't find a sense of purpose, but you do need to find some things to anchor that purpose in, what I call some inklings or some beckonings, some things that call to you so that you can then build a life of purpose around it. I call those purpose anchors. And a lot of people, when they're saying, how do I find my purpose? What they're really asking is, how do I find my purpose anchors so that I can build a life of purpose? And there's some really easy ways that speak to most people. And in the book, I talk about the 4 or 5 big ways to do that. And I can run through them really quickly with you. One of them is the life review, which I talked about in my first book, Taking Stock. This is the series of review questions we do in hospice with dying patients that they can review their lives. We ask them, what were their biggest accomplishments, biggest failures? What do they regret? What were the most important relationships? And we go through this structured series of questions, but you don't have to be dying to start doing that. So a life review is a great way to find anchors. The one sentence life review is, if I found out I was dying today or in the next week, what would I always regret never having the energy, courage, or time to do? Ask yourself that question. And regret in a dying person is disappointment, right? Because we don't have agency to actually accomplish those things. But regret in a young, healthy person, that's just another word for purpose. So purpose anchor can be a life review, or at least think about your regrets. That's number one way to start thinking about purpose anchors. Another great way is the joys of childhood. Like, what did you love as a kid? Often as kids, we have these just innate joys, these innate versions of purpose that we give up as we get older, when we pretty much get told about the American life script, right? You've got to get a job, you've got to make money, you've got to be a professional, all these things people put on us. But when we were kids, we didn't know anything of that. So horses, so we collected little toy horses and had horse posters, and maybe we went over the stable and took horse riding lessons. Really basic stuff. And a lot of people forget that stuff. So if you have no idea, go ask your parents when they cleaned out your room after you left for college and eventually moved away. What was in that room? Like, what lit you up as a kid? Was it sports? Was it horses? Was it drawing? All of those can be purpose anchors. Another big way, so that's number two. The third way, I often talk about the art of subtraction. A lot of people don't like their jobs, but they have one or two little things in their job they do like. So I stopped liking being a doctor, but what I really enjoyed was the 1 day a week where I went to my hospice meetings. So when I subtracted everything else out that I didn't like about my job, I had this one thing that I would do even if I wasn't being paid for it. And so I used the art of subtraction at work to find a purpose anchor, and then I built a life of purpose around it by doing more hospice work. There's a bunch of other ways. One is just the spaghetti method. Throw a bunch of stuff up against the wall, see what sticks. If you really can't find any purpose anchors, join clubs you don't normally join. Say yes to people you don't normally say yes to. Do things that scare you a little bit. These are all good ways of testing out. The key here is when we let go of this idea that purpose has to be something big and audacious, and say, what, I could have one purpose in my life, or I could have 100 different purposes. I could do this thing that's purposeful for a week, or I could do it for 5 years. None of that matters. What really matters is, what are the kind of things that you might enjoy that you can then build a life of purpose around? And so I say it's very abundant. And I've done purpose coaching with many, many people, and I've never found a single person who couldn't find something that they didn't want to build purpose around. Never happened.
And it makes sense. I mean, by the way, I think everybody, when you dig in, you could find it. It just, whether you want to do the work or, have you actually like walked through it? There's a book, if you haven't read it yet, it's interesting. It's called Orbiting the Giant Hairball. And it talks about how we suck creativity out of kids. You start off everybody starts off as an artist, but by the time you get, fifth grade, then, one's an artist. We just suck this creativity out. But if instead we can orbit the hairball and kind of like stay close, but still be ourselves, we can find that balance. But that, you are right, it's kind of countercultural, and let's call it out. Very little of what you just said in the purpose was like, oh, I got to have a Ferrari and a private jet.
Yeah, money doesn't make us happy. And I know a lot of people argue, and there are all sorts of studies out there. And if you want to talk about those studies, we can. But, and here's the real trick. This is the secret to the book that I tell you about 2/3 of the way in. It's not even purpose. When you look at the studies, the best one I've ever found out there, right, is the Harvard Adult Developmental Health Study. Started in the 1920s. They took a bunch of Harvard graduates, followed them every other year, eventually built in 1,500 family members of theirs, and then eventually built in another 400 or 500 people just from Boston as controls. And they did questionnaires every 2 years. They did MRIs, they did EEGs, they drew blood, they interviewed their families. I mean, this is the most extensive database of information that we prospectively followed for over 70 years. And what that study showed is when it comes to happiness, it's not money, it's not achievements, and even it's not purpose. What really brings people happiness is interpersonal connections. Now, the argument I make in my book is the greatest conduit to interpersonal connections is little p purpose. And so little p purpose unto itself, even though studies show that it brings health, happiness, and longevity, I think it does it because, again, when we're being our true authentic self and when we're engaged in little p purpose, we draw other people towards us and we build these authentic communities that matter to us. And that's where happiness lies. And I believe that's where impact and legacy lie too.
Let me challenge you a little bit there, because we have a lot of folks, we call them soloists, single, no kids, and about 30% of child-free folks will never marry. and there was a book on solo aging, and they were talking about building community and a lot of the same type of things you're talking about. Cool. What about the introverts in the world that are like, more people saps my energy? Like, how do you handle those? And I'll freely admit I'm one of those introverts, but like the community that draw people to you, all that, great for somebody that loves people. But like, there's some people that are never happier than sitting with their computer or their art and just by themselves doing their thing. I mean, how do you handle that?
Technically, could I imagine a person who loves painting and that's the most greatest important thing to them, and they lock themselves in a room? Let's say they happen to have enough money that they don't have to go out and make money, and they lock themselves in a room and paint all day for the rest of their lives till they die, and that brings them happiness and fortitude because that's their little P purpose. I guess that's imaginable, but it's probably not the reality for 99% of people. I'm part of the personal finance community, and of that, I'm part of the financial independence retire early community, and at least 75% of FIRE people identify as introverts. That doesn't mean they don't have close connections. It doesn't mean they don't have community. It does mean that people sometimes tire them out and it's hard for them to go, let's say, to a conference. But we live in a vast virtual world where you can connect with people in all sorts of interesting and exciting ways. So even for someone who is highly introverted, who doesn't like to be in the presence of other people, you may still have people you collaborate with online. If you're an artist, you may post your things online, even if you don't necessarily interact with other people around it. The truth of the matter is, most of us thrive on some type of connection. And so like where I can imagine there's a person out there who doesn't need it, the grand majority, whether they call themselves introverts or extroverts, build little communities around them. And I would argue that the happiest of them tend to have deeper and more enduring communities, whether they spend a lot of physical time in their presence or not.
I'm not saying, hey, people living the hermit life and never talking to people, going to be happy. I think my debate and kind of like where I come from is this, for the introverts, it might not be the volume of connections, but they tend to go deeper with one or two or three, like, hey, I got my one focus, my one little group. These are my three people. I'm good with my, but when people talk about community, they often think about big community. Maybe it's, big C, little c to go with your purpose. I don't know. But I just think there's this assumption that community means a whole bunch of people, and it doesn't have to.
Yeah, and I agree. The Harvard study doesn't say community, it says interpersonal connections. And so I think really the crux of it is to have deeper interpersonal connections. I think that tends to form community a lot, but it doesn't have to. And we know, for instance, as people get older, their communities concentrate, right? They go from bigger friend groups to smaller friend groups. I think all of that's normal. I think it's that one-on-one connection, though, that really lights us up.
I think you're right. I think it's just, when we hear the word community, it gets interesting. There was a research study I was looking at child-free folks and their neighborhood. And what they found was that often they were left out of community events because they were quote-unquote family-friendly events with parents, with the kids, and they don't invite the child. And I go, yeah, so build your own community. Like, build your people that are yours. And I don't care if they're in person, online, or in your video game or wherever. Who cares? Like, you can build that. And I think one of the bonuses you're getting to is, I'm a boating person. I saw a story in there about that. Hey, you spend a whole lot of time building a boat. You build a community around it. People. It's not the boat. It's the other stuff that comes with it. And I think you're on the right page. But, you might be just so countercultural that people aren't ready for that yet.
Well, here's the thing, and this is really the message of the book. Up to this point, most people talk about purpose as something very ephemeral and very anxiety-provoking, and we're supposed to have it, but we don't exactly know how to get it, etc. The idea behind little p purpose and big P purpose, the idea behind the book, The Purpose Code, is to make it much more approachable, right? This is to make it a concept that there is a boon out there. If we knew there was a pill we could take and we would live 30% longer and be 30% happier and be more healthy, we'd all take that pill. Well, we know that having a sense of purpose does a lot of these things, but unlike taking a pill, most people have no idea how exactly to approach that. And so the idea behind this book is to say, well, here's an approach that's straightforward that anyone should be able to do that will give you all those benefits and doesn't have to cause anxiety.
I'll give you that straightforward. I'm not going to give you that it's easy because there's a lot of personal work you have to do. You lay it out in the book and yeah, I get it. Yeah, yep, it makes sense. Probably got 5 years of work to get there. Like, is that fair?
What I found is there's no question any growth takes work and pain. Like the only way we grow is to step out of the comfort zone and walk into the uncomfortable area. So by nature, it's going to be difficult. The idea, though, is how can we take some of the stress and anxiety and pressure away so that you can do that deeper work more joyfully? And so work is good. And the most successful people I've seen in the world, it's not that they're afraid of work, it's that they find out how to make work joyful and interesting and meaningful, as opposed to it being stressful and anxiety-provoking. So my hope with this book is to not to say that it isn't going to be work, not to say that it might even be years of work, but to take the stakes down and say, you have this, you can do this, we can get rid of this being an all or nothing do or die and make this approachable enough that you're willing to do that work because you see the benefits today as well as tomorrow.
I'm with you. I've already recommended the book to my wife and a couple of my staff members. How do they get it? Kind of when's it coming out? Give us the details.
The Purpose Code drops January 7th, 2025. The easiest way to learn about the book or me is to go to jordangrumet.com. That's JORDANGRUMET.com. There you will see links to both of my books, Taking Stock and The Purpose Code, as well as all the places I create content, including the Earn and Invest podcast. So it's a one-stop shop, jordangrumet.com.
And I got to ask, is the book a capital P purpose or a lower P purpose to you?
Book writing has terms little p and big P purpose, right? Writing for me has always been little p purpose. I love the process of sitting down. I put on my classical music. I know kind of an idea of what I want to write. And the process of writing just lights me up. And so I know that this is something I'm going to continue to do. Now, I'd love to have a New York Times bestseller. I'd love to have tons of people buy this book. That would be a happy coincidence, side effect of doing something that I love. But if none of those things happen, I will still love writing books.
And by the way, I bring that out because you can both go, yes, I got a big P purpose. I want to hit the New York Times just like everybody else. But if I don't, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the ride. Like, there's a way to do it. So it's The Purpose Code, Jordan Grumet. Go grab it.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a rating or review. We'd love to keep the conversation going. Please let us know your thoughts wherever comments are available or email us at media@childfreewealth.com. To stay up to date, find and follow Childfree Wealth on social media. If you're interested in working with us, learn more by visiting our website, childfreewealth.com. We'll see you next time.